So now we arrive at the final stage of our journey, or the final chapter of our story, which is the global turn, our fourth turn. And here I'd like to talk about postmodernity first. There's postmodernity and there's postmodernism. I understand postmodernity is the condition, the situation. Postmodernism is a kind of cluster of different movements which share certain characteristics, certain reactions to the situation of postmodernity. In the present moment of Western history, we're often told that we're in a postmodern period, which is characterized by a lot of fragmentation, religious, intellectual, cultural fragmentation, and also an extreme individualism. I think that we can date this period from actually just after the First World War. So it would include the period between the two wars, then the Second World War, and up to the present, the succeeding events. From a Christian point of view, the era of postmodernity is featured by the Second Vatican Council, which is an epochal event in the history of Roman Catholicism, and I think in the history of Christianity in general. It's strange that after the First World War, which to many people looked like the end of civilization as they knew it, remember Spengler, Oswald Spengler's book, The Decline of the West, there was a lot of that kind of thinking at that time. As if something was coming to an end, and then something new was starting. And there was a strange springtime right after the First World War when there was a lot of free creativity that came forth. What you call modernism in art and in poetry began from that time, I believe, with a lot of influences from before that time, like French symbolism in poetry and so on. But a kind of unfettered creativity, a kind of wildness which could be shocking at the time. Maybe we've grown used to it, but it really was dramatic, as if the human spirit had been freed from a certain containment, from some kind of tissue of conventions, and now could just go in any direction it wanted to, and all of those directions seem to have been explored at that time. There's also something happening in science, wasn't there? And that was the new science, the new physics, the physics of relativity and of quantum mechanics, astonishing new breakthroughs into it, almost like a new world of understanding, as if some kind of a wall, or a concentric wall had been removed, and you got further out and further in somehow. And also there was that kind of, what would you call it, bipolar movement happening, so that you would both move inward to the atomic level and even the subatomic level, and then you move outwards towards the whole cosmos. So there was an expansive movement in both directions. You may remember that double movement also from what we've said about the event of Christ, where there was a movement inward towards union with the Absolute, union with God. There was a movement outward toward the plurality, the pluralism of Christianity, moving through all of the cultures and all of the peoples out to the ends of the human earth, you might say. We're not going to talk too long about the postmodernity thing because I want to get to our central subject, which is the global fact. But in that horizon of postmodernity, there's a tremendous, what would you call, tremendous complexity from the new philosophies and from the new science on one hand, the new psychology, transpersonal psychology, where you move to the boundary of psyche and spirit, and a kind of boundary encounter in every one of those realms, I believe. There's one big dividing line that runs through the postmodern era, and that is between the personal and the non-personal, or the anti-personal. Because I think that the human person emerges with particular force at this time as a, what would you call it, as a creative source, as well as a social fact and a social element. But the expansion, the extension can move either in the direction of the affirmation of the person, and the kind of respectful, what would you call it, respectful acquaintance and exploration of the person, or in an anti-personal and non-personal, or what might be called post-personal direction, which as far as I can see is totally without value, which has no worthwhile destination, I think. It corresponds to that impulse to deconstruct, to destroy, to deny. There's so much of postmodernism which has been about what would you call it? About annihilating any meaning, as a matter of fact, as if you had to start all over again, hardly knowing the alphabet, hardly knowing yourself as existing, or being unsure of your own existence, of the existence of anybody else, especially as a free human subject, and particularly of the existence of God, the existence of an absolute at all. So it's as if the West sprang into a freedom with no compass, a space of undetermination, of the indeterminate, in which everything goes, or anything goes, until you run out of fuel. Now the process that we're talking about, the inner process, I think, is globalization. I don't know how often postmodernity and globalization had been looked at almost as two sides of the same thing. You could think of postmodernity as a condition, but it's a condition that relates particularly to the inner person in the sense of the cultural activity, the cultural sensitivity of the person. Whereas globalization is distinctly outward moving. No, you can say it's convergent at the same time. It's outward moving in a sense for the individual, isn't it? Because the individual begins to look further around oneself. But it's inward moving as far as the concentration, the centration, as Teilhard might say, the concentration, the moving together, the convergence of human beings is concerned in the very globalization process. So move it outward from the human subject, move it inward from all of humanity, or on the part of all of humanity. From our point of view, in the Roman Catholic Church particularly, it looks like the movement, you could say the revolution, from a Eurocentric point of view, and from a single cultural complex, which Rana calls the Greek, and then the Hellenistic, and then the European cultural complex. From the, as it were, that culture dominating and determining the kind of Christianity, the kind of Catholicism particularly, which would be lived by any other culture. The cultures further out from that center. And with the Second Vatican Council, which is, what would you call it, a theological and spiritual interpretation of the process of globalization largely, that ends. And we move from a Eurocentric to a global Christianity. In principle, it takes a long while for it to happen in fact. So I'd like to talk about a few interpretations, three interpretations of the globalization phenomenon. The first one, and the one with the largest scope, is that of Teilhard de Chardin, who looks at the whole thing in terms of the general pattern of evolution, particularly human evolution, of course, when we're talking about a human process, but also the larger scale of evolution. So it's a matter of placing it in time, placing it in the whole scale, the whole long scale of evolution from the beginning up until the present. And Teilhard talks about this process in terms of planetization. He sees in, as it were, every species or every, every organism, every being, a kind of a movement from the solitary and the, you might say, the single advance, the single blossoming, or whatever you want to call it, to something that resembles a social movement. In other words, from the purely forward or upward to the lateral, to the inward movement, inward development of the same species. And he talks a lot about the outside and then the inside. He talks a lot about the within of evolution, which is a powerful and fascinating idea. That with all of the propagation of the species, we usually think of evolution as a branching process, as a kind of proliferation and expansion into many varieties, many species. But he points out that all along the course of evolution, there's something else going on, which you might say is the opposite, and that is the concentration and a centering upon a single stem, as it were, a single development, which finally turns out to be the development of the human person out of all of the other creatures and species which have appeared during evolution. There's a centering in this particular species, the human being. It's clear enough that there's nothing else like the human being on the planet, is there? We don't know of any other life that has consciousness, that has thought, that has the particular abilities of all kinds, the creative abilities, ability, what he would call, of reflection. That is a kind of consciousness which is capable of turning upon itself, turning back at itself, at which point, he calls it, I think, second-order thinking, at which point it achieves a new power, as if it expands and rises to a new, what would you call it, a new scope. And we're very familiar with this. We may not name it, we may not recognize it distinctly and by name, but we're very familiar with it. We do it all the time. This process of reflection, which Teilhard finds to be an advance in evolution, which characterizes the human person, the human species, and only the human species. Not only to be conscious, but to be conscious of being conscious. It's as if you could keep repeating that until you arrived at the center of some mass of consciousness, as it were. So Teilhard finds, moving just a little bit aside from that subject of reflection, Teilhard finds this globalization thing happening everywhere around us, and I think we're conscious of it. No matter what direction we look, we're going to come upon it sooner or later. We especially find it in the area, of course, just of social reality, of political reality, of business, economics, and politics, and all of that. We find that somehow, whatever we think about, we have to think about it in a global sense, in a global context, considering all of humanity. Now, this is the first time this ever happened. This is an astonishing new stage in human development and human evolution. So, and it calls for a good deal of analysis, a good deal of thought. I think we can be grateful that the Catholic Church has recognized this phenomenon in the Second Vatican Council and faced it, and I think taken an intelligent and courageous stand towards it. Not against it, but towards it. According to Teilhard, it's inevitable, and it can't be can't be reversed, it can't be rescinded, and it can't be altered. So the only choice that we have really is to try to resist it, which is a futile and wrong attitude, he believes, or to go with it. He says no power on earth, no power in the world can stop the power, can really, what would you call it, oppose and win out over the power of the world itself. Now, what's the power of the world itself for Teilhard? It's evolution, isn't it? It's progress through time. Progress through time into something new. And the fact of newness reminds us, doesn't it, of something else, which is the event of Christ. The event of Christ doesn't appear very strongly in Teilhard's vision, as far as I can see. He thinks rather of something further back, something at the beginning. Remember that everything was created through the Word, and Jesus is the Word become incarnate. Teilhard calls our movement into a global context and our acquiring of a global consciousness, as it were, as a new Copernican revolution. The first Copernican revolution, as far as I can see, was about space. Remember the change of vision from perceiving, as it were, the sun revolving around the earth, which is incredible to us nowadays. We're a little more sophisticated in physics and cosmology, to the heliocentric vision in which the earth, quite properly, revolves around the sun. The sun has a kind of dignity, a kind of power, a kind of astonishing fullness in it, which really fits completely into place when we realize that. It's like the discovery of God in a way, or the discovery of Christ. Discovery of a fullness around which we, in our limited nature, revolve. Well, he compares the global thing to the Copernican revolution, but it's something that's happening not in space, but in time this time, okay? Notice how in our modern age we've experienced a tremendous expansion, both in the scale of space and in the scale of time. I mean, we can talk about seeing things through the Hubble telescope that are, I think, thousands, if not millions, of light years away from us. And that's an unimaginable distance. And that's not only space, but it's time. Notice how light years is a distance, is space. And yet it's a space that's measured in time, according to the speed of light. So the term globalization for Teilhard appears in the language either of planetization or socialization, usually. And it's all about this process of reflection. The reflection that defines the human person, say the birth of intelligence on the earth, okay, that's sort of that amazing event of the creature beginning somehow to think, to be conscious of itself, and to be conscious in some kind of progressive or working mode. And then think of a second comparable moment, and this is going to come back in Ewart Cousin's vision. Think of a second comparable but different moment in which the reflection that defines the human person becomes a reflection between and among human persons. In other words, it's not just within the individual, it's the whole mass of humanity, as it were, that begins to be drawn inward toward in a reflective process. I can't help but think of that, once again, of that image through the Hubble telescope where we see the cloud of gas and dust concentrating itself, converging until it bursts into a star. Almost inexpressibly wonderful thing that's happening there. And that, I think Teilhard sees something like that happening in this process of globalization. He thinks it's going to go all the way. And when it goes all the way, it calls for a couple of things. It calls for a new force to pull together what formerly had been repelled. If you think about human persons, think about a bunch of men, for instance, who try to form a community. There may be an equal and opposite repelling force, divisive force between them because of their different wills, their different ideas, different backgrounds. It'll push them apart. So a stronger force is needed to bring it together. Same thing about this globalization thing, about planetization of human persons on the earth, according to Teilhard. There has to be a new energy, a new force that's strong enough to overcome the repulsion. A better, more adequate image of that is the nucleus of the atom. Okay, any atom. Take a hydrogen atom. The nucleus of it, which holds together. No, hydrogen is not such a good example because the reason is there's only one particle, only one. What do you call it? Only one subatomic entity in the nucleus, and that's the proton, just one of them. It takes two of them to repel one another, okay? So call it helium or something like that. But there's a tremendous repulsive force between the subatomic entities that are in the nucleus of the atom. So it takes a greater force, a nuclear force, to hold them together in spite of that repulsion. So Teilhard is talking about something strictly analogous to that, I think. That because of our natural, what would you call it, individualism and our natural differences and our, you might say our competitive instinct as well, it takes something very strong to hold together the human elements, the human units. I think that's probably more true of men than it is of women, but at any rate, I believe it's true. So he sees something comparable to nuclear energy in the physical universe being called for, which is not yet quite evident. So he's calling for a new kind of force, and he would call it love. I'm sure he's got a couple of synonyms for it, but basically it's a stronger attractive force. And so that may happen, so that may come on the scene, emerge, whatever you want to call it, it takes for a center of attraction to pull things toward one another. To make things converge, there has to be something in the middle that's strong enough. Guess what that is? For Teilhard, it's the Christ Omega. It's the risen Christ who somehow becomes the gravitational center of the whole universe, and particularly of the human universe. And why is that? Because he became a human being, because God became a human being in Christ. And only that divine human being can center the kind of energy that's needed to overcome the human resistances and the human repugnances and all of that. And it's simply a human egocentrism and selfishness that pushes us apart rather than pulling us together. So that's Teilhard's bold and dramatic notion of globalization in the big scheme of evolution. Now here's a second vision. It's of Ewart Cousin's. Ewart Cousins is basing his vision both on Teilhard's vision and also on the work of Karl Jaspers, who originated the idea of something that he called the axial time. Now the axial time for Jaspers involves several different movements, several different changes, but one of them, and the central one, is the emergence of the individual, the personal consciousness. the emergence of a personal mind which has separated itself out somehow, pushed away, as it were, all the conventions, say, of the tribal consciousness or of any other consciousness which is, as it were, formed from outside itself. So for Cousins, as well as for Jaspers, this is where the personal consciousness begins. So Jaspers has located this axial time in the first millennium, the first 1,000 years before our present era. That is, with its center about 500 BC, somewhere around there. And he finds this happening in about 5 or more different places around the globe. Let me quote it. Know thyself became the watchword of Greece, okay? So there's the Greek mode of reflection and of breaking through to a new depth and power of human consciousness. The Upanishads identified the Atman, the transcendent center of the self, and that's a really, what would you call it, transcendent realization of non-duality, as we have mentioned before. The Jewish prophets awakened individual moral responsibility. Remember the prophets and how strong they are on that responsibility, for instance, not only towards God in worship and in faith, but also towards your fellow human beings. And that's something new, practically something new in the world, I think. And it's a new mode, and a profoundly new mode of human consciousness. The sense of individual identity as distinct from tribe and nature is the most characteristic mark of axial consciousness. From this flow other characteristics, for instance, a consciousness that you can use for analysis, for social criticism, for developing scientific theories, and so on. And he says that both our cultures and our religions at present derive from that axial time. So says Jaspers, and so agrees Cousins. But Cousins wants to talk about a new axial time, a second axial time, which looks like it's the opposite of the first one. If the first axial time is the historical moment of the emergence of a personal consciousness, you can guess, after we've talked about Teilhard, what the second axial time might be. It's parallel to Teilhard's notion of socialization or planetization. That is, it's the convergence of the individuals who emerged in the first axial time into a global consciousness. That is, some kind of a communion of consciousness, some kind of you might say, a parliament or a council of individual consciousnesses in which a communion happens so that actually humanity begins to think, to reflect as one being, which seems quite logical, doesn't it? In the sense that we're all made of the same stuff, we all work the same way, and we have the same problems in the end. So that's quite an appealing vision, I find, the vision of Edward Cousins. I remember I went to the Parliament of World Religions in 1993 and listened to Cousins talking about this, then ran out and bought the book. The title of the book is The Christ of the 21st Century. And it's that first part where he talks about the second axial time. I believe that he stood by that vision of the second axial time until the present. Now, Teilhard and Cousins have a lot in common here, don't they? Both envisioning a process of human convergence in different terms. Teilhard in the great evolutionary context, moving backward and forward in time, and Cousins in the sense of human history and the big epical steps and quantum leaps, as it were, in human history. The first of which, according to him, would be the axial breakthrough, and the second would be the second axial breakthrough. One of the individual consciousness, and the second of the communal consciousness, as it were, which is just beginning now. Now here's a third view of convergence. And this is a smaller context, you might say, but in the end, I don't think it's a smaller context, and it's something that expands. It's from Karl Rahner. Remember, we talked earlier about the 3 ages of the church, according to Karl Rahner, and he's thinking principally, not solely, but principally of the Roman Catholic Church, which is in a sense easier to grasp in a single vision. First age, Jewish Christianity, all right, lasting only most of the way through the first century. so up to about 70 AD, I believe. And then that gives way to a second phase, and these two are ridiculous in the sense of their disproportion. The first phase is only about 40 years or 50 or something like that. The second phase will go in from close to the end of the first century to 1962, when the Second Vatican Council started. Because for Rahner, the Second Vatican Council is the first council of the world church. Okay, you've had these smaller partial churches, and then he sees this epochal time when somehow humanity is concentrating in that way, that the church moves with it and plants itself at the center of that convergent movement and begins to speak to humanity differently. For one thing, in the church, in the Second Vatican Council, the church begins to speak to the whole world, and it says that. It addresses the whole world to give somehow a kind of, what would you call it, a translation of the good news that every human being can understand. And so the whole world begins to be conceived, begins to be envisioned by the church, and in a positive way. And this is, what would you call it, the recovery, I think, from the Augustinian depression in which the world was going to hell. You may remember the words of Rahner about Augustine. No, you don't, because I didn't read them to you before. This is Rahner on Augustine, and the kind of global pessimism which Augustine passed on to us. Now, Augustine was a great figure, a great mind, but nevertheless, his vision was largely determined by his context at that time, and especially the end of the Roman Empire, the kind of pessimism that was pervasive at that time. And also a narrow idea of salvation. The pessimism is also evident, and in a very related way, in his strong notion of original sin, that we begin, as it were, as a mess, as a what would you call it? As a creature who is already in deficit, as it were, and who has no positive potential at all, until grace comes to rescue us. Not that there isn't some truth in that, but it's a great exaggeration. Okay, here's Rahner on Augustine. World history, according to Augustine, remained the history of the massa damnata, which means the damned mass, the damned rabble of humanity, from which, in the last resort, by a rarely granted grace of election, of choice, only a few were saved. So everybody else, as it were, is doomed and damned. This, writes Rahner, expresses, For Augustine, the world was dark and only weakly illuminated by the light of God's grace, a grace that can be seen by its rarity to be unmerited. In other words, that grace is received only by a few human beings. The rest are lost. And so it's far from our own abilities to save ourselves, that's for sure. Whereas in Vatican II, we arrive at an attitude which Rahner says is a more mature Christian awareness that has grown over a long period and has slowly come to terms more closely with the ultimate basic message of Jesus on the victory of God's kingdom. Victory of God's kingdom is not very easily seen in the salvation of a few people out of a huge number of people. And so with Vatican II, we have a new optimism about humanity as a whole. Other thing about Vatican II and the world is that the world begins to talk not only to Vatican II, the church begins to talk not only to all of humanity, not only to the whole world, but also changes its language, changes its tone. There's a gentleness in the language of the Second Vatican Council and its documents. There are no condemnations. It's rare to find Vatican II pointing out the error of some group or some person. It's not saying, and let him be anathema, about somebody who's on the wrong track. There's none of that. And I think basically the church changes from the language of power, the voice of power, to the voice of humanity. That is the cordial the cordial voice, the cordial, friendly speech of one human being to another, with no grievance, with no accusation, with no condemnation, with no complaint, but recognizes somehow the value, the dignity, and the autonomy of the other. It's a wonderful step. From the language of power to the language of humanity. Can't help but think in that respect of those things that happened a little earlier, only about 20 years earlier, and back from that too, but culminated in the Second World War, and that was the totalitarian regimes of Hitler and of Stalin. I may have mentioned that book, The Bloodlands, by Timothy Snyder, where he adds up the numbers and finds out that between those two regimes, 21 million people were murdered deliberately, not just as collateral damage, but by policy. And that's amazing. That's evil on a larger scale than perhaps has ever happened before on this planet Earth. And that's in two countries, or from two countries, which had been Christian countries. And one can't help but be reminded of the words in Matthew's Gospel that when the evil spirit has gone out of a person, remember, it looks around, searches for a place to live, or a place to move into, but it doesn't find any. And then it says, well, what I'm going to do is go back into the place where I was cast out. And then he goes back and he finds it clean and empty and looking very hospitable. So he moves back in and he takes with him 7 demons more evil than himself. And the state of that man, at the end, the last state of that man is worse than the first. So we're reminded of that when we reflect on that history of the 20th century and what happened in and around Soviet Russia and Nazi Germany, both of which had been Christian countries. If before the time of the council, theologians wondered about how many people were to be saved from the general disaster of world history, today we wonder whether all may be saved. That's another aspect of this optimism which we have moved into with Vatican II. So, for Rana, the Second Vatican Council is the first council of a world church in which Latin is no longer the dominant and obligatory language for liturgy, for instance, and that means that's the signal, as it were, that the different peoples of the earth, different races, different nations will begin to be able to, and cultures, begin to be able to, as it were, recreate Christianity in their own language, in their own way of understanding, in their own creativity and so on. I don't mean to be exaggerating, I don't think I am. And it can't be completely fragmented. Obviously, always in Roman Catholicism, at least, there's going to be a strong central element holding things together. But it's a dramatic change from what was before. When you think of how centralized the Roman Catholic Church has been, and how everything has been constrained within uniformity by the very language, even the thinking was constrained within the Latin culture and Latin language. So that's a big change. So we've discussed 3 authors, 3 thinkers, as it were, who have evolved a notion of, or you might say who have chewed upon the fact, the empirical fact of globalization and tried to envision it theologically, or at least theoretically. And there's a lot of agreement here. There's a lot of agreement about the depth and the scope of this change that's happened, as well as the fact of it, as well as the actuality of it, and a reflection about the response of Christianity to it, and particularly, of course, of the Roman Catholic Church. All 3 of our witnesses have been Roman Catholics, so there would be another vision, I'm sure, from other quarters. Now, I'd like to move on from these 3 witnesses to 3 other individuals who have gone at the same fact from a different perspective, and that's the perspective of what consciousness we need to have as we move along in this process of global convergence. as the stream, you might say, of planetization or socialization or global convergence moves forward, what does that mean as far as our inner attitudes are concerned, as far as our aspirations are concerned, and in the end, as far as our behavior is concerned? The first witness here is Simone Weil, or I'll say Simone Wilde. So Simone Wilde was very attractive. She died in 1943, and the story is that she nearly starved herself to death. She was living in England at the time, sympathetic, of course, to the French resistance and so on. And what she's famous for is refusing to be a Catholic, while in her soul she considered herself a Catholic. And the reason why she refused, she wouldn't let herself be baptized, was because she said that the Catholic Church was not Catholic enough for her. Now, Catholic Church is with a big C. Catholic, as she meant it, as she respected it, is with a small c. What that means is universal. So the Catholic Church, as it was at that time, and I think that's especially true, say, in the 150 years just preceding the Second Vatican Council, the Catholic Church at that time excluded or condemned, or at any rate rejected, so many things that she loved and so many things that she respected, and knew that somehow they belonged to Christ, but the Catholic Church wasn't big enough to accept them, wasn't big enough to respect them, nor even in some cases permit them. I'll find a couple of quotes of hers. She concluded that God didn't want her in the church, otherwise he wouldn't have given her that resistance, otherwise he wouldn't have let that division exist. And also, what would you call it, that kind of attitude of resistance exist. Christianity being Catholic by right, but not in fact, Catholic with a small c. It is universal, should be universal, but not in fact. It's not universal. I regard it as legitimate on my part to be a member of the church by right, but not in fact. So she says that the church is Catholic, not in fact, but by right. So I shall remain a non-Catholic, even though I'm a Catholic in my heart. I'll remain a non-Catholic by right. I'll remain a non-Catholic in fact, not by fact. Well, I belong to the Catholic Church, but by right. The language seems a little tangled there. Upon the universality of the Church depends the success of the historical process of incarnation. She understands that her personal obligation is to show the public the possibility of a truly incarnated Christianity. Now, she's connecting incarnation with universality there, isn't she? So she'll say that the original grace of Christianity, the grace of the Holy Spirit, as it were, had to be inclusive of absolutely everything that is not simply evil, had to be inclusive of absolutely everything. Otherwise, Christianity would never have absorbed, would never have brought into unity all of the different nations, all of the different peoples of Europe. Okay, kind of a strong argument. So she talks about a new saintliness proper to our time, new holiness, which is distinguished by its universality. It's almost as if she reconceives sanctity not in a vertical axis, but in a horizontal direction, okay? There's the breadth rather than the height. Here's Simone again. We have to be Catholic, that is to say, not bound by so much as a thread to any created thing, unless it be to creation in its totality. So she doesn't want any parts, she wants the whole thing. Be very insistent, absolute, as it were, on that idea of universality and inclusiveness. Formerly, in the case of the saints, it was possible for this universality to be implicit, even while their consciousness was smaller, was narrow, because of the culture and because of the church in which they lived. They were able implicitly to give the rightful place in their soul, on the one hand, to the love due only to God and to all His creation, on the other, to their obligations to what is smaller than the universe. She thinks that St. Francis of Assisi and John of the Cross exemplify this, and that's why they're both poets, she says. That's why both Francis and John were poets. Our times, writes Wilde, have no precedent, and now universality which could formally be implicit has to be fully explicit. We have to witness to it somehow with our lives. So that's what she's trying to do. As it were, standing astride that boundary line between the inside and the outside of Catholicism. It has to permeate our language and the whole of our way of our life. This new era demands a new kind of holiness, itself without precedent, so something absolutely new. A new type of sanctity is indeed a fresh spring, an invention. If it is kept in proportion and in the order of each thing is preserved, it is almost equivalent to a new revelation of the universe and of human destiny. It is the exposure of one large portion of truth and beauty, formerly concealed, now concealed under a thick layer of dust. More genius or ingenuity is needed than was needed by Archimedes to invent mechanics and physics. That's giving Archimedes a lot of credit. A new saintliness is a still more marvelous invention. So much for Simone. It's clear and simple, her idea, her demand for universality, which she calls Catholicity, in the church as well, the Catholic Church, and especially in it. Now to Thomas Merton. Thomas Merton, another 20th century figure who died in 1968, I believe, so 20 or 25 years after Simone. He's got an essay based on the work of a Persian psychologist, Reza Araste. Now, the title of Merton's essay is Final Integration Toward a Monastic Therapy. And it's in the volume which appeared after his death in 1971, called Contemplation in a World of Action, a collection of his late writings. The book of Araste, the Persian psychologist on which it's based, is called Final Integration into the Adult Person in the Adult Personality. Came out in 1965 in English. It wasn't written in English, but it was translated and appeared. So, what this notion is, Merton's notion, and that based on the psychologist, is that it's possible for a human person to arrive at a kind of transcendence of cultures, so that he doesn't belong just to one culture, but he belongs somehow to the whole constellation of cultures, to the whole of human cultures. Final integration might be called a third birth, following first physical birth, and then the second birth, which is growth from infancy into responsible adulthood. Araste studies this third phase of growth in three concrete individuals. First, the poet Rumi. Secondly, the Western writer Goethe, from the end of the 18th century, and a contemporary young Turkish man. So Merton describes in glowing language this state of final integration, which corresponds so perfectly to his own personalist ideal of the attainment of the true self. Final integration, very different from adjustment to one's social environment, is a transcultural maturity in which the person, having transcended the ego and all cultural limitations, lives from within, having somehow become now cosmic and universal. At this point, the person has been open to a capacity to be identified with everybody. So Merton's a powerful writer, and he's an enthusiastic writer, and so and an idealist. Okay, so whatever he's interested in at a particular moment seems to be it. All right, it with a capital I, and so it is here, and that's what makes his writing so powerful, I think. So in describing the person who has achieved this final integration, he says, he is truly Catholic in the best sense of the word. There we are with Simone once again. He has a unified vision and experience of the one truth shining out of all its various manifestations, some clearer than others, some more definite and certain than others. He does not set these partial views up against one another, in opposition to one another, but unifies them all in a dialectic of insight of complementarity. With this view of life, he is able to bring perspective, liberty, and spontaneity into the lives of others. So, there you have, he's rounding out the human ideal that has always been a central part of his vision, Martin is. And finally we come to B. Griffiths, who has quite a different vision. He speaks of the universal wisdom. Remember that notion of perennial philosophy that we mentioned earlier? That is, what would you call it? A perspective, a philosophical, spiritual, you can say theological as well, perspective which has always been in humanity, at least ever since humanity moved into a rational level of consciousness, and which is, and you might say, all the time and everywhere, present somehow in every culture, and becomes explicit in the more advanced cultures, including the spiritual traditions of India and China. Found at the heart of each of the world religions, he believes. Now, I could be quite critical about this because I think that it ignores the event of Christ, as it were, okay, and ignores what's happened, let us say, after Christ in the development of human religion. But I'm just going to go with his vision, which stands alongside that of Simone and of Thomas Merton. This reality has no proper name, in the words of Bede, since it transcends the mind and cannot be expressed in words. It was called Brahman and Atman, the spirit, in Hinduism, Nirvana and Shunyata, the void, in Buddhism, Tao, the way, in China, being, To On, in Greece, and Yahweh, I am, in Israel. But all of these are just words which point to the inexpressible mystery in which the ultimate meaning of the universe is to be found, but which no human word or thought can express. It is this which is the goal of all human striving, the truth which all science and philosophy seeks to fathom, the bliss which all human love, in which all human love is fulfilled. So this universal wisdom emerged in the axial time, and in each of the great religious traditions. In each of the great religious traditions, it evolved into a complex philosophical system, but beneath the external differences, the same reality, the same realization, the same experience, and the same unity remains. So Griffiths wants us to recover that original, that primal unity and that universal wisdom. And I have to mention again that he ignores a good deal of, especially of the distinctiveness of Christianity, and the fact that besides what's there at the beginning, as it were, this is like a primal wisdom that's there at the beginning and continues and percolates down through all of the cultures through time, remaining essentially the same. But I think what he ignores is the event of Christ and the difference that makes, and particularly the event of Christ under the aspect of incarnation. That is the descent of the absolute, the descent of that non-duality, the descent of pure absolute divine spirit into the human person, in which a different kind of life becomes possible and a different kind of realization, which we call by the name of faith. Faith which develops into hope and into love. The one movement, as it were, the one inner movement of the human spirit that's introduced by the divine spirit, the Holy Spirit, as a result of the death and resurrection of Christ.